it's not surprising that Rome has been a very memorable backdrop for numerous films. Next slide, please. For example, The Great Beauty, Sorrentino's wonderful homage to Rome. And next slide, please. Very few people of a certain age can forget the amazing scene in Vita, where the actress more or less a boss in the trip. And it's also a city that has been central to Western civilization for a couple of thousand years. And some would say it's one of the world's longest enduring tourist traps. Certainly anyone who visited Rome wanted to come back with a souvenir. Sometimes the souvenirs were very grand, as we can see in this next slide. This is called Modern Rome. And can we have the next slide, Matthew? That's it, thank you. And this was a souvenir painted by by Bennini, frequent mistake, painted by Bennini. This was a souvenir for the departing French ambassador to Rome. And another example of the centrality of Rome to the Western imagination is this famous map of Rome, the Falda map, produced in the 1670s, a huge map. And just to show you how important Rome was to all educated people in the 17th century, this map hung on the wall of the study of the famous diarist Samuel Pepys. Pepys never went to Rome, but Rome was so important to him as an intellectual, as a man of letters, that he wanted to have some tangible evidence of Rome in his study, where he did all his important work. Next slide, please. Now, what we're going to talk about today is, this evening, is not just Bernini, but is also the Rome of the Baroque. Can we have the next slide, Matthew? And Baroque is one of those things that's easier to recognize than it is to define. I kind of like the half humorous definition, which says that Baroque is when, instead of a straight line, you draw a curve. And there's an element of truth in that. The Baroque is very playful. It's very expressive. Here we have, of course, the famous cupola of Sant'Ivo by Baroque. It was a very popular style in continental Europe. Next slide, please. It reached its apogee not just in the churches of Naples, for example, but also in the churches of southern Germany, like this one, where there is just a riot of gilt and plaster and color and light. You know, the Baroque lets you have it with both barrels all the time. It was never really that popular a style in England, although, of course, there was an English Baroque. Can we have the next slide, please? This, for example, is Blenheim Palace. Quite sort of exciting and shocking by English standards, but actually rather restrained and well-mannered by the standards of Italian or German Baroque. And could we have the next slide, please? Possibly the most famous Baroque building in England is St. Paul's Cathedral by Christopher Wren. But the Baroque was a style that the English really didn't like, because to them it was much too involved with the Catholic Church. So the Protestant establishment in England hated it. And it also smacked of sort of absolutist authoritarian rule. So it was equally objectionable to the so-called Whig progressives, who were coming to be a very powerful political force in England at that time. Maybe the best way to contrast Renaissance and Baroque is to look at two great sculptures of David. The first one is, of course, the David, Michelangelo's David, a beautiful work, an absolute sort of epitome of human physical perfection. I have to say, I find it quite boring. It's too restrained. To me, it's too bloodless. It's almost too beautiful. Let's contrast it with the less well-known, but I think much better, David by Bernini. Now, this is an exceptional work because, unlike the static, poised nature of Michelangelo's David, Bernini's David is like a still from a film. triumph, you know, not at the moment of rest after he's defeated Goliath, but we see him at the moment of maximum peril. He's twisting, he's just about to throw the rock aimed at Goliath, the giant. If he hits Goliath and kills him, he will be one of the great heroes of all time. If he misses Goliath, he's going to be dead. So this is an incredible snapshot of a young hero just about to reach for immortality. And it's very much not only a literal self-portrait of Bernini, because we know that they held up a mirror to him while he sculpted, so he could do this as a self-portrait, but it is also a self-portrait that sums up his whole career, his phenomenal energy and ambition, his innovation. So let's look at the man. Here is Bernini in two self-portraits. Next slide, please, Matthew. Thank you. As a young man on the left and as an old man on the right, he had an extraordinarily long career. You know, he was born in 1598, and he worked almost up until his death in 1680. So, you know, by 17th century standards, he was a very, very, very old man throughout much of his career. And it's worth remembering that at a time of great, great art in Europe, Bernini was regarded as the greatest artist in Europe. And let's look at some of his competition. Rembrandt, for example, was around at the same time. Vermeer was around at the same time. Velázquez was around at the same time. Yet Bernini was ranked above them all in terms of his genius as an artist. And it's worth reminding ourselves of that. Now, he was, as Matthew pointed out, a child prodigy. He was a kind of a Mozart of sculpture. If we look at this portrait bust, and you can find this in the church of, we can find this in the church of Santa Prassede, just by Santa Maria Maggiore. Santa Prassede is one of my favorite churches in Rome. You know, it's got some incredible early Christian mosaics, and Zena's chapel is just wonderful. Now, this is a funerary bust of a papal functionary. This was carved by Bernini when he was 12 or 13 years old. And even more remarkable is this next bust, which is of the Florentine physician Coppola. And this is a really extraordinary work. Bernini was 14 or 15 when he did this. And it's remarkable, not just because of the technical expertise that it shows, but it has real psychological insight. And it shows that Bernini was wise and insightful and psychologically acute well beyond his early teenage years. He really came to citywide and then nationwide prominence with a series of sculptures that he did for Cardinal Borghese, and you can see all of these in the Villa Borghese. So there is the Rape of Proserpina, there is incredible Daphne and Apollo. This is a bit of a snapshot because succumb to Apollo's advances, and we can see the turning into the twigs and bark and leaves of a laurel tree to escape from the Libidinous god Apollo. And then finally, amongst the great Borghese sculptures, we have the portrait of Bernini as David. And these three works of art were created for the next man, please, who is Cardinal Scipione Borghese. This is his portrait by Bernini. You are probably familiar with the idea of the cardinal nephew, the cardinal nipote, from which, of course, we get the English word nepotism, favoring one's family unfairly. Popes needed their nephews. Popes, of course, were not supposed to have children, although they did, but they needed a blood relative to be looking out for them. So usually the most important person in the papal establishment after the Holy Father himself was the cardinal nephew. Scipione Borghese was an exception. He was a great connoisseur. He was hugely rich. He was a great patron of the arts. And he was the first person to really cotton on to Bernini's genius and promote him with the Roman establishment. Let's look at another view of the cardinal. Can we see this next one? This is a caricature by Bernini of the cardinal. It's probably more revealing than the rather formal portrait bust, and it's kind of an astonishingly modern work of art because it looks very much like a caricature from the 1930s. And it shows that one of the things that Bernini did was actually invent the art of caricature. Now, Bernini's next great patron was this man here, Pope Urban VIII. Can we see him, please, Matthew? Urban VIII Barberini. And this is a good time to rehearse the fact that the role of the Pope in the 17th century was very different from the role of the Pope today. So the 17th century Pope was not just a spiritual and religious leader. The 17th century Pope was also a formidable political player. And this is because the papacy controlled a broad sweep of central Italy, which was known as the Papal States. Can we see the maps? And if you look at these maps, you can see just running diagonally across the Italian peninsula in purple, we see the area of the Papal States. Remember, Italy was not a country. It was, famously in the words of Metternich, Italy was a mere geographical expression. It was an extraordinary kind of tossed salad of principalities and duchies and city-states and kingdoms, and the great powers of Europe, France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, were constantly fighting with each other for control of the Italian peninsula. And the Pope, in many ways, held the key to the Italian peninsula. So he was a very important secular leader. Now, one of the things that Urban VIII was very keen on, aside from enriching his own family, was beautifying, in particular, St. Peter's Basilica. And he employed Bernini to do a number of very important works there, the most astonishing of which is, next slide, please, the sensational Baldacchino. The Baldacchino is a canopy. Can we see the next slide, Matthew? The Baldacchino is a canopy which shelters the high altar of St. Peter's and beneath it the tomb of St. Peter himself. It's an amazing thing, and thing is how I can describe it, because what is it? Is it architecture? Is it sculpture? Is it decoration? It's the largest bronze structure in the world. It's 30 meters high. It's nearly the height of a 10-story building. And with it, Bernini dissolved the boundaries between architecture, sculpture, interior design. And this is very typical of the Baroque, all these different art forms merging together. Can we just see the next two slides, please, Matthew? And he was a wizard working in bronze, and this established him not just as a great genius of an artist, but also importantly as someone who was a brilliant manager, a brilliant project manager, because Bernini was very good at getting things done. So he got the Baldacchino finished, and then he moved on to do the colossal shrine of the chair of St. Peter, another great, hugely complex, hugely difficult, hugely expensive work of bronze. So Bernini was, really, really fantastic as a manager of complicated projects, but he was a man. He was not just an artistic genius. He was a complicated man with his flaws, like all of us. And his major flaw was probably the love of his life. Can we see the next slide, please? Costanza Bornarelli. Now, this, by any standards, is one of the most remarkable works in the history of Western art. It's a life-size marble portrait bust. And in general, because life-size marble busts are very expensive and very difficult to execute. They were reserved for gods and goddesses, mythological figures, kings, queens, and super important people. This is the first ever marble portrait bust of an ordinary woman. An ordinary woman. He's actually looking very casual. You know, she's got a slightly disheveled nightdress on. Her hair's a, you know, a little bit of a mess. She is a real ordinary woman. And this is a remarkable portrayal of such a woman. She was the love of Bernini's life. Unfortunately, she was also married to Bernini's #1 assistant, and she was also having an affair with Bernini's brother. So this caused a fantastic hoo-ha in Rome. She was, you know, because in those days, it was always the woman's fault, of course. You know, whatever the man did, they always blamed the woman. And poor Costanza, who was pretty blameless, certainly no more blameworthy than anyone else. Poor Costanza was sent to a home for fallen women. Bernini's brother was merely exiled from Rome for a period of time. And Bernini himself was merely just ordered to get married to a so-called respectable woman, which he did. The next important pope to have anything to do with Bernini is this geezer, Innocent X, who was the Pamphili Pope. Here he is in that famous portrait by Velasquez, looking extremely, extremely cruel and calculating. He was a difficult character. He didn't want to employ Bernini at all because Bernini was associated with the previous Pope. And in general, every time a new Pope arrived in town, he brought with him a family that had to be enriched, retainers that had to be employed, and a whole troupe of artists and poets and sculptors, all of whom needed commissions. So he wanted to sweep clean all the previous artists who'd been associated with the Barberini regime and bring in his own people. But Bernini was too good to be ignored. Innocent X commissioned a major new fountain for Piazza Navona, which is where his family palace and family church are. And he invited all the top artists and architects in Rome to compete for it. In the end, he had to give the commission to Bernini, and the result is this, the Fountain of the Four Rivers, which many people think, I agree with them, is the most beautiful fountain in the world. And it's an amazing feat of engineering because you have a huge Egyptian obelisk weighing tens and tens and tens of tons, balanced over an open void, flanked by allegorical figures of the world's most important four rivers. And if you look closely at the full-length view of it on the left, you can see why many people, me included, believe it was very much the inspiration for the Eiffel Tower. It is an astonishing work of art, astonishingly powerful. Now, for Italy, for the papacy in particular, 17th century Europe was blighted by the 30 Years' War. Can we see the next slide, please? The 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648, was the single greatest catastrophe to strike Europe until the Great War of 1914, 1918. There were millions of casualties. There was unprecedented savagery against the civilian population. It was one of the first total wars in history. Now, generally, you could say that it was the Protestant states of Europe fighting against the Catholic states, but of course it was much more complicated than that. Quite often the Protestants were allied with the Catholics, Catholics would be allied with Protestants, and so on. It was very difficult shifting political puzzle, a kind of a Rubik's cube of alliances. And traditionally, the papacy would be called in to be the peacemakers of such things. Well, this was different because the papal nuncio, can we see him in the next slide, please? The papal nuncio or ambassador who was sent to sort it out is this man, Fabio Chigi. Chigi was the ambassador in Germany. He tried to negotiate a satisfactory end to the 30 Years' War, and he failed because the 30 Years' War ended up with the Catholic Church being much weaker in the end than it was at the beginning of the war. Nonetheless, Chigi was rewarded for his efforts. He came back to Rome, he became Papal Secretary of State, and eventually he was elected Pope as Pope Alexander VII, and he became Bernini's most important patron. One of the things he wanted to do was to improve the status of Rome, because he thought that by beautifying Rome, he could also enhance the power of the papacy. There are precedents for this. For example, this guy, the somewhat comically named Pope Sixtus V, was the person who really began the most important beautification of the city of Rome. He began replanning the streets of Rome. Can we go to the two slides that have little maps of Rome, Matthew? Sixtus V began, let's go to the next one, replanning the streets of Rome, because he wanted to make it easier for pilgrims to get around Rome. Every 25 or 50 years, whenever there was a holy year, Rome attracted hundreds of thousands of pilgrims. And this was a huge business. It caused a great increase in donations to the church and amazing prosperity for the innkeepers, the tavern owners, the prostitutes, the booksellers, the horse handlers, all the people of Rome who benefited from the tourist trade were enormously grateful for these huge pilgrimages every 25 or 50 years. And in order to make it easier for pilgrims, Sixtus V made the street plan of Rome slightly more rational, creating new, long, straight roads. And if we go to the next slide, please, Matthew, he had a brilliant idea, which was to use ancient Egyptian obelisks. This is the one next to St. John Lateran. He used these ancient Egyptian obelisks as sort of punctuation marks or signposts in the cityscape, so that if you were a pilgrim traveling around the 7 great pilgrimage churches, you would look out for the next obelisk and head off in that direction and get to where you wanted to go. And this was the beginning of a beautification of Rome, which was intensified and sped up by Pope Alexander VII. Could we have the slide after the next one, please, Matthew? The next one, please. This is the Chigi Chapel, Alexander VII's family chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo, an incredible place, which I urge you all to visit if you haven't already. I mean, people go to Santa Maria del Popolo and look at the 2 wonderful Caravaggios here. Do not miss the Chigi Chapel. Talk about greatest hits, originally designed by Raphael and finished by Bernini in honor of the Chigi family. Now, Bernini was a very clever businessman. Can we see the next slide, please? And his working method is perhaps exemplified by the way in which he dealt with this man. This man is Francesco d'Este, who is the Duke of Modena. Now, he was the richest aristocratic ruler in Italy, and he wanted his portrait bust done. So he wrote to Bernini, requesting that, and he also wrote to Bernini's great rival, Alessandro Algardi. Algardi wrote back immediately and said, yeah, I can do you a portrait bust. I'm quite busy, though. It'll take a year and it'll cost you 300 scudi. Bernini wrote back and said, no, I don't do such things. I only do portraits of my friends, and those I consider most worthy, and I'm very busy, and I don't quote prices, and thanks for your interest, but no thanks. Of course, d'Este couldn't resist that. He couldn't face being brushed off by anyone. Months and months and months of correspondence followed. Bernini ended up deciding to do the portrait bust, for which he never quoted a price. The Duke ended up paying Bernini something like 20 times as much as the price quoted by Algardi. So Bernini knew that by playing hard to get, he would constantly be more desirable. And he did the same thing with the most powerful man in Europe. Next slide, please. Louis XIV, the new young king of France. The great fact of political life in 17th century Europe was the decline of Spain and the rise of France. Louis XIV was very aggressive, very rich, very clever, very young. He was determined that France should be the most important country in Europe, which it became on his watch. And he wanted the most important artist in Europe to come to France. So he asked the Pope to send him Bernini. The Pope refused. Louis XIV asked again. The Pope refused. There was a long pattern of refusal. Finally, it got to the stage where Louis actually had to threaten an invasion of Italy to get the Pope to agree to send Bernini to Paris. And Bernini came to Paris with the intention of designing a new extension to Louis's palace, which was the Louvre. This was before Louis decided to move to Versailles. Can we see the next slide, please, Matthew? This is Bernini's idea for the Louvre. Rather Baroque, very Baroque, actually. The French hated it, particularly Louis's chief advisor, who said to Bernini, it won't do at all. And Bernini said to him, Monsieur Perrault, how dare you criticize me? You're not fit to brush the dust off my shoes. Well, as you can imagine, this did not get on very well in the French court. And Bernini was politely urged to leave. The Baroque Louvre was never built. Instead, what we got is this. Can we see the next slide, please? Which is the sort of much more neoclassical version of the Louvre. Now, people have asked me, you know, where do you go in Rome to look at Bernini? And I should say, where do you go in Rome not to look at Bernini? Because Bernini, during his long career, was extraordinarily productive. A lot of his work was the embellishment of churches. Can we see the next slide, please? That's in Santa Maria della Vittoria. And it is the famous sort of mystical vision of Saint Teresa. And most importantly, aside from his embellishment of the interiors of Roman churches, Bernini also beautified the city. So, for example, Bernini Fountains. Yes, the Fountain of the Four Rivers is the most spectacular one, but also look at the joy and the brilliance of the Triton Fountain in Piazza Barberini, which just makes that rather dull square a totally magical place. And of course, Bernini's architecture is quite apparent in Rome. Can we see Sant'Andrea Quirinale, just opposite what is now the presidential palace, which of course used to be the papal residence. I mean, in Bernini's time, the popes, Alexander VII in particular, didn't want to live in the Vatican, which was not regarded as being a very healthy location. He wanted to live up on the Quirinal Hill, which was breezy and had beautiful views of Rome and was regarded as much healthier. Possibly the greatest contribution Bernini made to the Roman landscape is, the next slide, please, is the great Piazza of St. Peter's. Now, when Bernini designed this, can we have that slide, Matthew? Yeah, when Bernini designed the Piazza of St. Peter's, he said that he wanted to come up with an architectural vision that was like the arms of the church embracing the visitor, encouraging those with no faith and improving the faith of the faithful. And he came up with this wonderful scheme, these two colonnades around an elliptical piazza, obelisk in the center. It is one of the most thrilling urban spaces in the world, and it's impossible to stand there without being entranced and excited. It's an amazing space. Now, Bernini had a very close personal relationship with Pope Alexander VII. You can see it in this little clay sketch. Next slide, please, which is a little clay model that Bernini did of Pope Alexander VII as a preparation for Alexander VII's tomb. But you can see it most vividly by going to the Piazza della Minerva, where there's the incredible monument of the elephant and the obelisk. I think you've all seen this because it's impossible really to be in Rome without wanting to see the elephant of the Minerva. And you can sort of say, as I first did when I saw this, why is there an elephant in the Piazza della Minerva? What's that got to do with anything? Well, it's very much a personal tribute to the Pope. In the 17th century, all educated people knew that elephants were a symbol, not just of strength and good memory, but also a symbol of religion and faith. And this was regarded as the perfect tribute to Pope Alexander VII. And on the plinth, there's a very long Latin inscription. Alexander VII loved long Latin inscriptions. There's a very long Latin inscription saying that it takes a robust mind to bear solid wisdom. And this was a monument to divine wisdom as received by Pope Alexander VII. And if we look at the next and final slide, please, just look carefully at the elephant's face. It's not exactly the most realistic depiction of an elephant. And some people have thought, and I'm inclined to believe them, that it's not just an elephant, but it's an elephant that looks rather like Pope Alexander VII. So do think about that next time you're in the Piazza della Minerva. And thank you for listening. And now I'm ready to take any questions that you may or may not have.